Hello, welcome to another screencast. This is going to be part 3 of our series on cognition. In part 3, these are the things we're going to cover. The G factor versus multiple intelligences, intelligence extremes. We'll have a public service announcement. We'll talk about emotional intelligence, and we will have twin studies. Okay, let's get started. First of all, is intelligence an ability or abilities? That's the first question. A guy named Spearman thought that there was a general intelligence. He called it G, which was an overall intelligence that is linked to many specific abilities. So that's the same as like having an IQ. IQ and G are kind of the same thing. In contrast with that, for example, on G, people who do well in AP Psych tend to do well in other classes also. People who do really poorly in one class at Bozeman High tend to do poorly in other classes as well. So you usually don't have someone who's really good at AP Calculus and who is failing 2 or 3 other classes. So that's an argument in favor of the general intelligence. In contrast is the theory by Howard Gardner called multiple intelligences. There are 8 in this chart. He's added a 9th called existential intelligence. But this idea is that you can have one of these be really high for you and maybe a couple that are really low and a couple that are average, but that they aren't all linked. So you could have somebody with a really good musical intelligence or a really good understanding of nature, or a really good understanding of words and language, and they might not have other skills. And one argument in favor of this is people who are savants. Savants are the people who tend to have low intelligence, but they have one area that they're really good at. And we saw a video of the guy who had the outstanding memory and could draw. He flew in a helicopter and he could draw exactly what the skyline of Rome looked like. So he had this amazing spatial intelligence. Okay, extremes intelligence. We know there's the normal curve, and there's within one standard deviation 68%, 2 standard deviations 95%, and then there's the tails, a high intelligence, which we would call gifted, or lower intelligence. This chart says mental retardation. Today we would call it having an intellectual disability or cognitive delay. Those are kind of the more appropriate terms. With high intelligence, there's this sort of stereotype of people being really smart, being kind of nerdy or socially awkward. And when you research people with high intelligence, that's just not true. They're perfectly healthy, social-wise, and well-adjusted individuals. Of course, some of them might be a little awkward, but regardless of what your intelligence is, there are some people that are a little socially awkward. With lower intelligence, people often talk about individuals having Down syndrome. A long time ago, if you had some serious intellectual disability, you would be sent to an institution. Nowadays, babies are staying with their families. They're getting something called early intervention therapies. So my son had speech therapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy starting when he was 6 months old. And he's had that 3 times a week his whole life. And so that makes a huge difference. He will likely be able to grow up and have a job and live independently, maybe get married. So it's really different from what disabilities were like 50 years ago. Also with Down syndrome, it's caused by having an extra chromosome in every cell of your body. It's chromosome 21. That causes some other health complications. So it's not just an intellectual delay. There's problems, could be with your digestive system, your heart, all sorts of things. So my PSA for people with intellectual disabilities is that we shouldn't label people according to the one thing that they're lacking. And we should think about people in a holistic way, and all they do and all they bring to the world. Everybody has value. And so labeling somebody and defining them based upon having a low IQ is It's really kind of an unfair way to think about people. I'm going to fast forward through some pictures here. Okay, so be careful that you don't let labels affect your perception of what others can and can't do. All right, what about emotional intelligence? This is another idea. A lot of people say that emotional intelligence is more important than IQ in terms of success in life. If you can read and understand other people's emotions, you're going to do well. So there's different dimensions, different components of emotional intelligence: perceiving, understanding, managing, and using emotions. If you can do this, you'll have better relationships with people, better relationships with coworkers. You'll be able to navigate social situations better. So emotional intelligence can really help you out. So there's a debate in psychology about what's more important to your intelligence. Is it genetics? Is it something you're born with? Or is it environmental influences? And they've done a lot of research on twins to study this. And if you look at the first bar, identical twins reared together, that's the highest correlation of intelligence scores. So it's two twins. How similar are their scores? They're very similar. If they have the same nature, that's the identical twins, their genes are exactly the same, and the same nurture. By nurture, I mean their environment, their home environment, their social environment, their educational environment. If you look at the second bar, it's identical twins reared apart, so separated at birth, adopted by different families, still very high correlation with intelligence. If you go down to the fifth bar over, unrelated individuals reared together. This is people who are adopted and reared in the same house, but they have no genetic material that's the same. And that's a very low correlation of their intelligence scores, which means that their nurture, the environment, plays a smaller role than the genetics. You can also look at adoption studies. And this graph shows that adopted children and their adoptive parents have a very low correlation of intelligence, and adopted children and their birth parents have a very high correlation of their intelligence. So once again, this is showing that nature, the genetics, is more important. Okay. Finally, we'll just end up with a question about bias in testing. Any of these IQ tests, you have to be careful about bias. Whatever questions they're asking, the wording, the topics, if those things are specifically more applicable to a certain social group or ethnic group or religious group, whoever doesn't use those words or doesn't interact with those topics, say the topic of golf, if there's 2 or 3 questions on an IQ test about golf, well, usually that's played by wealthier people. So people with low socioeconomic status might not get those questions right. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. That is part 3 on intelligence. We will stop it there. See me if you have any questions in class.